Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Ceely Rose Murders at Malabar Farm by Mark Sebastian Jordan. Narrated by Mark Sebastian Jordan. For all the friends, family, and fans who have kept me going. Preface. I felt an odd mixture of familiarity and strangeness as I drove through Pleasant Valley. I had once spent a tremendous amount of my time there, directing play productions, working at Malabar Farm State Park, and later operating a hostel on park grounds. Since I had left, not a lot had changed, although of course each minor difference seemed monumental, considering how intimately I once knew this place. The mighty maple in front of the old hostel had come down. The Malabar Farm restaurant was closed for renovations. The ornate big house mailbox had been taken down. This place was no longer home to me. I was there on a mission. I was returning to finish the book I'd been threatening to write for almost 20 years. Pleasant Valley is a broad, beautiful valley running northwest-southeast in the lower right corner of Richland County, Ohio. It was one of the first parts of the region to be settled. Its fame had circulated internationally on the basis of both the Ceely Rose case and the later appearance of Pulitzer Prize-winning American novelist and conservationist Louis Bromfield. Malabar Farm is Bromfield's estate, transformed into a public park after his death. In more recent years, the valley again became famous as the home of the Shawshank Oak, the massive tree featured in the classic film The Shawshank Redemption. It sat in the field next to Valley Hall School, the one-room schoolhouse Ceely Rose attended until the tree fell. The valley's significance in earlier times wasn't just as a gateway into Richland County. It was one of the last deep valleys of Appalachia. Indeed, the stone cliffs that stopped the advance of the last ice age 12,000 years ago hang over both Bromfield's big house mansion and the small Rose farmhouse. This place was the gateway by which humans returned to the ice-scoured ground, made rich by deposits of soil as the glacier retreated. This was a borderland, separating flat farmland from the hills of Appalachia, separating the townfolk of the county seat, Mansfield, from the rural farmers. It was even in some sense a border separating north from south, for the hill settlers of Ohio tended to come from points farther south, often harboring sympathy for the Confederate cause during the Civil War, and still highly decorated with Confederate flags and bumper stickers today. The northern part of the state was settled by New Englanders and Middle Colony people. The Mason-Dixon line may have been a few hundred miles south, but culturally, this was the border. Holmes County, just a few miles southeast of Pleasant Valley, was home to an open armed rebellion quickly crushed at Fort Fizzle in 1863. That same year, Copperhead Democratic presidential candidate Clement Vallandigham was arrested for treason by Lincoln's troops on the square in Mount Vernon, just a few miles due south. While most of the Pleasant Valley residents remained loyal to the Union, there was still a sense that they were apart from the county seat of Mansfield, an aspiring industrial city with a completely northern feel. The Rose family was from deep southern Ohio. Even among the country folk of Pleasant Valley, they were even more country. In 16 years of residence, it seems they never entirely lost the identification as outsiders and strangers. Their own private family dysfunctions did nothing to diffuse that impression. I'm glad I waited to write this book. It took me years to understand how the Ceely Rose case wasn't merely the story of one family's self-destruction. It was the story of an entire society that had trouble figuring out what to do with an outsider. It's an issue we still have today. I wish I could say I were confident that we'd do a better job dealing with Ceely Rose today. Often, I doubt we'd even do as well as the people of Pleasant Valley did 125 years ago. I parked the car in front of the Pleasant Valley Lutheran Church, the same church where Ceely Rose confessed to her friend that she had murdered her family. As I walked toward the Rose family graves in the cemetery across the road, I became aware of the peripheral names in the story spread out around me. Here were Ceely's defenders, the Ohlers, the neighbors, the Berries, Flora Schrack, who wrote an eyewitness account, and even Guy Barry, the object of Ceely's obsession. In death, he lies only a dozen yards from the family whom Ceely Rose poisoned, thinking this would clear her path to her true love. Instead, Ceely herself lies buried more than 100 miles away in the patient cemetery of the Lima State Hospital. The resonance of these stories was palpable. My own involvement with this case goes back to 1982, when I was 12 years old. That Halloween, my mother, knowing my already well-developed taste for the macabre, pointed out an article in the newspaper. It was a typical Associated Press filler article, something originally created as a news release by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources about alleged hauntings in state parks. I was surprised to find that the bulk of the article was devoted to a local legend, Ceely Rose, who had poisoned her entire family in 1896 in a small farmhouse still on the grounds of Malabar Farm State Park, where I had once gone on a school field trip. This fascinated me and became the motivation for future visits to the park, where I took tours and learned more about the case. For a number of years, I forgot about Ceely Rose. I grew up and became very involved in regional theater as an actor, writer, and director. In 1994, I was working in the office of a scrapyard run by my uncle, because theater in rural Ohio sure as hell won't pay the bills. When I took a lunch break and stopped by the bookstore in the nearby mall, I found a book titled Haunted Ohio by Chris Woodyard. Suffice it to say that little work got done that afternoon in the office when I discovered that the first section of the second chapter of her book was devoted to the Ceely Rose murders. Woodyard had plunged into the archives to consult some of the original media coverage of the case, bringing it to life in my mind's eye. I got chills not just because of the spooky story, but because I immediately knew that it was going to be my next play. That summer, while working as an assistant stage manager on a production of South Pacific, directed by Larry Evans at the Renaissance Theater in Mansfield, I plunged into research. I spent my free hours in the John Sherman History Room at the Mansfield-Richland County Public Library, pestering reference librarian Boyd Adelsberger for help with the cranky microfilm machines. My research assistant, my 12-year-old niece Michelle, and I poured through old newspapers for hours on end, turning up tremendous amounts of long-forgotten information. I spent a lot of money ordering records from the National Archives and making trips to the places involved in the story. Wrapped up in these source materials, I wrote my first draft of the play in less than a week. I later revised the script and submitted it to a new play competition held by the Ohio Theater Alliance, where it won an honorable mention. Then, not knowing what to do with it and unable to find any Mansfield community theaters willing to produce a new full-length work, I sat on the script for a few years. My friend and theater technical director Daniel J. Feiertag insisted that the play had to be produced, so I finally contacted Malabar Farm State Park, asked if it could be presented there, and found an eager collaborator in park manager Louis Andrus. By doing it as a co-production between the Malabar Farm Foundation and the Mansfield Playhouse, with community support from the Richland County Foundation, we were able to finally bring Ceely to life in 2003. The first production, presented in the very barn at Malabar Farm that contains beams from the original grist mill that Ceely's father operated, sold out before it even opened. This led to a series of productions of Ceely and other historical dramas over the next dozen years. All that time, I meant to start writing a book that would set down the historical details I had dug up over the years, without the compression and dramatic license necessary for a stage production. But it never felt right. It was only many years later, after I'd become more practiced in writing history and more attuned to the outward ripples of the story, that I was finally ready to write this story. After so much preparation, it seems a startlingly slim book to me, but I hope it will preserve knowledge of this infamous case and serve as a springboard to any future researchers who come along. Chapter 1. Mysterious Deaths. As spring turned to summer that year in Pleasant Valley, the weather had been off. The rains of the spring of 1896 hadn't ended as June tried to ripen into summer. Good weather for potato bugs and other pests. Bad weather for planting. Bad weather for milling. Half deaf from ending up too close to the fighting decades before in the Civil War, David Rose could work only intermittently throughout the year at the old Schrack Mill. David had bought the shambling hulk when he moved his family north from southern Ohio into the highlands of Richland County near Lucas in 1879. In an age when old water-powered mills were rapidly being replaced by gasoline-powered threshers, Rose was able to buy the 3-story mill for a song, although limited business kept his income fitful. Rebecca, his wife, helped support the family by weaving rugs in the front parlor of the small 2-story miller's house that sat across Schweitzer's Run from the mill. If David was known for being irascible, Rebecca was known as the rock of the family, determined, immovable. Their son Walter was almost 40, but still living at home. Walter alternated between working as a day laborer for neighboring farmers and helping his father at the mill when David's shaky health limited him. He also tended the pigs the family raised for food. Then there was Ceely. Her given name was Celia, but pronounced with a long E sound, as befits the Appalachian foothills of Pike County, Ohio, where she was born in 1873. Even after 16 years in north-central Ohio, the Roses were still regarded as the outsiders, a bit coarser than the rest of the rural community. Ceely Rose was well known around the valley as even more of an outsider. Shy and giggly, she was referred to as a girl even though she was, in fact, 23 years old. She was thought to be a little slow by those who had dealt with her, earning her the nickname Ceely Rose. For years she had attended the one-room red-brick Valley Hall School, without ever progressing much further than the most basic skills. At recess she could be found either playing with the little children or cheering the boys as they played ball. At home, Ceely had been taught the simpler skills of housekeeping, including some cooking and sewing, but she showed little ability for anything as complicated as weaving. Ceely seemed at best a simpleton to be tolerated, at worst an imbecile to be ignored. She seemed otherwise harmless to everyone she knew. They could not have been more wrong. On Tuesday, June 23rd, David Rose was feeling strong enough to get some work done. He walked upstream from the mill to the 2 mill ponds and opened the sluice gates to fill them. By tomorrow, he'd be able to release the water to run down the sluice, gradually angling along the riverbank, to enter the basement of the mill and turn the water wheel. The exertion tired him, but he slept well that night. Breakfast Wednesday morning, June 24th, was eggs, slices of bread, bowls of cottage cheese with cherries from a tin can, and coffee. Some accounts claim that Ceely made all of it. Others state that she merely helped her mother, preparing certain parts of it. David was hungry and ate 2 full plates. Walter ate a full plate, while Rebecca had only a little due to the headache with which she had awoken. David noticed that Ceely was standing by, watching them, not eating. He asked her if she was going to fix a plate for herself. The girl seemed startled by the question. But then she picked up a plate and spooned a small amount of the eggs and cottage cheese on the plate. She didn't touch it. Finished with breakfast, everyone prepared to get to work. David headed to the mill to get started on the large feed grinding order he had set up the day before. Walter put on his jacket and headed up Ferguson Way with a gallon pail to investigate a rumor of some black raspberries having already ripened along the edge of the woods. Rebecca prepared to start a new rug on her loom. Before setting up the loom, Rebecca noticed that she had come down with a terrible thirst. She asked Ceely to fetch her a cup of water. Ceely did so. When Rebecca took a deep drink, her stomach muscles suddenly convulsed, causing her to vomit so violently that she collapsed on the kitchen floor. The explosive action made Ceely giggle. Rebecca tried to rise up, but further convulsions returned her to the floor. She could not stop vomiting. She ordered the girl to go get her father at the mill. Ceely ran out into the yard, avoiding the foul-tempered chickens that often pecked at her legs, crossed the rickety bridge over Schweitzer's Run, and alerted David that Rebecca was, quote, puking all over the place, end quote. David hurried back to the house and helped Rebecca into a chair, where she continued to suffer stomach pains even though her stomach had emptied its contents. When she attempted to down more water to combat her intense thirst, it again came back up. David realized that her illness was serious and headed outside to hitch up the horse and buggy. He knew that their usual family doctor, Dr. Budd of Perrysville, was out of town that week. So he headed south over the ridge toward Newville, where a younger doctor had recently set up shop. By the time David Rose arrived at Dr. John McComb's residence in Newville, his mouth had dried out severely. He explained his wife's illness to the doctor, who immediately readied himself to accompany Rose back to the mill house. As they rushed back up onto the ridge, David's sense of thirst became maddeningly keen. He begged off to stop at a farmhouse and ask for some water. It isn't known which farm they stopped at, although it could have been at the Ferguson farm on Newville Road. But the result of David drinking water was instant and violent. He collapsed into severe stomach convulsions and vomiting. The doctor succeeded in loading David back into the buggy and sped on over the ridge into Pleasant Valley. With some effort and some help from Ceely, he was able to get David back into the cottage and into the front parlor, where he lowered the old man onto a couch. While this was going on, a neighbor suddenly pounded on the front door with an emergency. He had just found Walter Rose up the road by the Ferguson woods, passed out in the ditch. He had thrown up. He must have come out and collapsed just moments after the doctor passed through with his father, unless in his haste the doctor had sped past and never even noticed Walter fallen near the road. The doctor went and gathered up Walter, returning him to the house and attempting to make him comfortable on a cot in the back parlor. Dr. Combs looked around at the sick and moaning family, violently ill, except for one. Ceely Rose stood to the side, wide-eyed, watching it all with fascination. Chapter 2. A Dream Halted. The Rose family was part of a general exodus of close-knit clans from Schoharie and Rensselaer counties in upstate New York to the southern Ohio frontier in the early 1800s. Avoiding the quickly growing communities such as Columbus and Cincinnati, these families sought the rural hills of Highland and surrounding counties such as Brown, Adams, Pike, and Ross, areas not unlike upstate New York and not unlike the ancestral homes of some of the families in the hilly northern parts of Hesse in central Germany. With the rugged, unglaciated hills of southern Ohio came swift-flowing streams, an ideal site for milling. Lawrence Rose came to the area shortly after the death of his grandfather, Wilhelm Roos, in Colchester, New York, in 1819. DNA testing has proven that relationship, although it is unknown which of Rose's sons was Lawrence's father. What is known is that Lawrence Rose took on the trade of milling in Highland County, and he trained his son David, born June 2, 1829, to be a miller too. Lawrence's wife was Thankful Reynolds, daughter of Daniel Reynolds and Lucretia Warden, from families of English descent also living in Rensselaer County, New York. Lawrence and Thankful married in Brown County, Ohio in 1820, and soon set up house at a mill somewhere in Highland County, most likely in the eastern part of the county near the village of Sinking Spring, which straddles the border between Highland and Pike. When David Rose later married, he wed a young woman from the Easter family. The Easters appear to have come through Pennsylvania and traced back to the Oester surname from Germany. Jacob Easter came to Highland County as a young man, marrying Margaret Stultz in 1825. Their daughter Rebecca was born on August 23, 1834. Little is known of David and Rebecca's early years, including when they first met. They were married by Justice of the Peace James Hetherington in Concord Township on February 8, 1855. The surviving tintype photographs of the two appear to have been from an engagement or wedding locket later given to their surviving daughter. How long David Smith Rose apprenticed with his father, or even if he did, is uncertain, although it must be thought probable, as David appears in the 1850 census living with his parents in Brush Creek Township in southeast Highland County. Both David and his father are listed as millers. Their mill may have been on Brush Creek or one of its tributaries. The creek flows southward out of the county into Adams County, passing beneath the bluff where the prehistoric Serpent Mound effigy earthwork is perched, before the creek joins the Scioto River, which soon exits into the vast Ohio River. The entire area of Brush Creek Township is the center of an ancient meteorite impact crater that shattered bedrock throughout an 8-mile-wide circle. When the time came for David to set up his own homestead, it had to be near a mill where he could pursue his trade. This apparently took him farther into the region's rough hills, into Pike County, east of Sinking Spring. Early histories of the county do not record a great deal of information about mills, so it is impossible to know whether Rose had a mill of his own. In all likelihood, he did not, as his property does not directly touch on the nearest body of water, Shoemaker Creek, which is more of a stream than a creek anyway. He may, however, have rented someone else's mill or worked in a mill owned and supervised by someone else. There was a mill near Byington on Sunfish Creek, run by a number of different owners throughout the 19th century, but David Rose is not listed among them. If he worked there as an assistant, it would be a longish daily commute by horse. More likely he worked at the mill in Kincaid Springs, near the village of Latham, within reasonable walking distance. In 1854, David went in with his brother-in-law, Philip Rhodes, to purchase a parcel of land just north of Latham in Pike County's Mifflin Township, just 7 miles east of Sinking Spring. The land straddles a modest ridge between Campbell Hill and Latham Hill. Atop the 600-foot-tall ridge were unimproved forests, perhaps including some of the poplar trees sought after for lumber in this area in the mid-19th century. If so, then Rose's aim may have been to not only build and farm on the property, but also to lumber it. That latter activity would have been curtailed by his health after the war. Some cropping may have been possible on cleared land, but the soil is thin on the ridge, so it is likely phosphate fertilizer would have been necessary for any extensive raising of crops. It would be more likely that, like many farm families in Appalachia, the Roses kept a vegetable garden for their own needs and left the rest of the cleared land as grazing pastures for livestock. Indeed, the 1860 Pike County Farm Census identifies Rose as having 80 acres, only 7 acres of which are improved. The family was in possession of 1 horse, 1 milk cow, and 5 hogs. No farm equipment was noted, and the only cropping done was 60 bushels of Indian corn, presumably raised as hog feed. In 1865, Rose bought out his brother-in-law's portion of the land, and just a month later sold the southern half of the property to David Nisley. That left the Roses living on a 63-acre parcel. The land today is part of the Pike National Forest. Although no structures survive on the property, the 1915 U.S. Geological Survey topographical map indicates a building standing near the northeast corner of the property, on the top of the ridge. Inspection of the site supports the idea that this would have been the location of the house or cabin for the farm, as the top of the ridge is the only ground anywhere close to level on the entire property. The hill's sides slope away at a precipitous angle, unsuitable for building. What's more is that the general ridgetop area matches up very conveniently to the 7-acre improved part of the land described on the 1860 farm census. A potential house foundation is visible about where the structure was indicated on the topographical map. A spring lies just a quarter-mile south on the top of the ridge. David and Rebecca's married life did not start easily. In 1856, Rebecca gave birth to a son they named John. Unfortunately, the rate of infant mortality in 19th century Ohio was high, particularly in a rural backcountry area. John did not survive a year. On December 1st, 1857, their second son, Walter W., was born. Although later descriptions of him did not compliment his intelligence or manner, he was strong enough to survive. At some point in 1859, a daughter, Julia Ann, was born to the Roses. It looked like they might finally flourish as a family. That dream was halted by the outbreak of the Civil War. David patriotically enlisted on September 8, 1861, offering his skills as a miller to the Army. Assigned to the 63rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, Rose plied his trade in the service of a frequently relocating regiment. But it shouldn't be thought that he was safe from the fighting by working as a miller, for the rapidly changing shape of a battle all but guaranteed that non-fighters would also get swept up in the action at times. Under Colonel John W. Sprague, the 63rd OVI was put into the Ohio Brigade, which earned the surrender of Island No. 10 in the Mississippi River at New Madrid, Missouri, in early April 1862, allowing Union forces to pierce deep into the Confederacy. Later in the year, the regiment fought at the Battle of Iuka and in the Siege of Corinth. The year 1863 saw the regiment moving throughout northern Alabama. After an 1864 furlough allowed the men to return for a visit to their families, the 63rd OVI became part of General William T. Sherman's Atlanta campaign, and then was included in the following March to the Sea. After some mop-up work in the Carolinas, the regiment was part of the Grand Review of the Armies in May 1865. The regiment was mustered out on July 8, 1865, in Louisville, Kentucky. Where was David Rose in all this? He was probably not there at all for many of the later activities. We don't know the details, but Rose's surviving military service record in the National Archives tells the story of a rocky career at best. At a special muster on August 18, 1862, Rose was marked down as, quote, deserted, July 23, 62, supposed to be in Highland County, Ohio, end quote. One wonders if he returned home to help Rebecca and the children. He may also have been concerned about the declining health of his father. Lawrence Rose finally passed away on June 15, 1864, and was buried at the Olive Branch Cemetery, west of Sinking Spring. At some point, David returned to duty, but it wasn't his last unexcused absence. On April 17, 1863, Rose deserted, only to return on April 30th. On October 31st, in Memphis, Tennessee, he was listed as sick in quarters. He was sick at Decatur, Alabama on May 1st, 1864, and was admitted into the General Hospital in Chattanooga, Tennessee, because of chronic diarrhea on May 17th. Evidently, his case was so severe that he was transferred to the No. 1 General Hospital in Nashville 2 days later. On May 22nd, he was transferred to a hospital steamboat, the USS Charles McDougall, which transported him to the No. 6 General Hospital in New Albany, Maryland, where he was admitted 4 days later. He finally returned to the regiment on June 30th, 1864. He was furloughed on August 3rd to visit home, but then deserted again on November 30th and never returned. Regardless, Rose was honorably discharged in January 1865. When David Rose applied for disability in 1890, his stomach problems were cited, along with related disease of kidney and rectum, causing burning sensations and frequent urination at night. But the veteran's problems didn't end there. He also noted partial deafness in both ears, resulting from his military service, suggesting that somewhere in the war, Rose may have been in proximity to weapon fire in battle. One form also claims loss of right eye as part of his disability. Dr. Allen W. Budd of Perrysville, Ohio, swore an affidavit about having treated Rose for years for his chronic diarrhea. He also noted the eye issue. Quote, said claimant has but one eye. The bad eye is defective from past inflammatory trouble. I have known him to be confined to a dark room for days.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?